Great. I see a few participants joining us already. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to go ahead and get started because this is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So people will catch up with us as they go. So welcome to the Evolution of Black LGBTQ Leadership hosted by the LGBT Historical Society. My name is Terry Beswick and I'm the Executive Director of the Society, and I'm here to introduce tonight's event and the moderator and then get out of the way. But first, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the LGBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land. I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous people. Also, I want to thank Lee Pfeffer, a Museum Operations Manager, for putting together this event tonight in collaboration with tonight's moderator, Bryce. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and on our website. Many people are watching the live stream on Facebook, and we welcome you all, but please note that while Lee will try to monitor your comments, our panel will not see your comments and questions until they point them out to them. So if you are watching though with us on Zoom, we welcome your active participation in the forum, and we encourage you to post questions for the moderator or the panelists in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and post any comments in the chat box as well. Please post the comments to all panelists and participants unless you want to just send it as a private message. And Lou will be off screen assisting the moderator in fielding your questions. So who are we? Founded in 1985, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites: the LGBT Historical Society Museum, located since 2011 in the heart of the San Francisco Castro neighborhood, and the John P. DeCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market neighborhood. And although our physical locations are expected to remain closed at least through mid-August due to the pandemic, please check out our growing array of exhibitions, events, and archival resources on our website at lgbthistory.org. And finally, I want to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible. If you are not already a card-carrying member of the LGBT Historical Society, please consider joining today. Members get a variety of perks, including a 20% discount on our online store. So now on to tonight's event, the evolution of Black LGBTQ leadership. Since long before we began collecting historical materials in our archives, Black LGBTQ leaders have been at the forefront of protest and revolutionary movements. Marsha P. Johnson, Miss Major, and others protested in the streets. Strategists such as Bayard Rustin worked behind the scenes to combat inequality, and thought leaders like James Baldwin moved the intellectual conversation forward. Tonight's esteemed panel will shed light on these revolutionary leaders, tracing the arc of justice from the civil rights movement of the 1960s to the burgeoning LGBTQ rights movement of the 1980s to the modern day movement for Black lives. Foregrounding the significance of intersectionality and intersectional movements, these assembled activists and movement leaders will share their own personal experiences and provide critical historical context and social commentary on racial and LGBTQ justice in America. And with that, allow me to introduce tonight's moderator, who will introduce the panelists and lead the discussion, and then I will hop off and watch the live stream with everyone else on Facebook. So, Bryce Salado is a Black, queer, transmasculine policy advocate, educator, facilitator, and writer. Bryce has almost a decade of experience working at the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender in education, social change movements, and politics. Bryce has expertise in education equity, progressive policy, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, civil rights history, and LGBTQ advocacy. He also has experience working on political campaigns and crafting messaging for political causes. He has worked at internationally recognized LGBTQ organizations such as the National LGBTQ Task Force and the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, GLSEN, where he advanced inclusive non-discrimination and anti-bullying policy at the local, state, and federal level. He has developed strong leadership skills while serving as a board member at the National Center for Transgender Equality, Trans Law, and the Massachusetts Commission for LGBTQ Youth. And with that, thank you, Bryce, and all of our panelists for all your work and your leadership and for bringing us and our viewers your knowledge, experience, and wisdom, particularly now when we as a society urgently need to build our awareness and sustain our focus on Black lives and racial justice and equity. Thank you all for your work. Have a good night, and I'll see you on the other side.
Yeah, thank you, Terry, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you to all of our panelists who are here tonight, as well as everyone who's watching on Facebook Live and who's part of the Zoom chat and the Zoom conversation. Just thank you, everyone, so much for being here. I also have a really soft spot in my heart for the Historical Society as someone who also identifies as a historian. So really excited to be leading this conversation with so many great people, friends and colleagues. And, you know, let's dive right in. So without further ado, I want to give the panelists some time to introduce themselves. So we are going to start with the one and only Kylar.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kylar Broadus. I'm a trans activist, but I actually consider myself broader than that. I am known as a trans activist, but I identify as a man of trans experience, a Black man of trans experience, who's been in this civil rights arena for 30 plus years. I'm glad to be here tonight celebrating this experience. And I said celebrating because I do think we want to get together and talk these ideas. It is a celebration of exchange of mind, energy, and experiences. So I'm glad to be here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kylar. And I should say, I should introduce myself, I realize. My name is Bryce Salato. I use he, him pronouns. And in addition to all the work that Terry mentioned, I'm also the founder and head of strategy at my consulting business, which is Swarm Strategy, where I focus on social equity and social impact work. So yeah, just want to throw that out there as well. And yeah, thank you, Kylar. Really excited to have you. Crew, would love to have you introduce yourself.
Okay, here we go. What's up, y'all? My name is Mcdew. I am the founder of the Black Lesbian Archives. We've been going strong for 3 years now. We started off through a spiritual awakening of really trying to find myself as a Black lesbian, and then the rabbit hole kind of dug in from there. Went in and started to uncover the voices of Black lesbians throughout the world, and hey, continuing to go strong. So thank y'all for having me, definitely.
Yeah, thank you, crew, and super excited to hear more about that later. Thank you. Crystal, I'd love to have you introduce yourself.
Okay, there we are. Okay, hi, I'm Crystal Mason, and longtime San Francisco resident, longtime activist. And right now, the shape of my activism is as the co-director of Queer Rebel Productions. And we are intergenerational QTPOCC performance organization, one of the oldest here in San Francisco. And, you know, one of our main jobs is to keep QTPOCC stories alive and uplifted, and creating space for people to be on stage, to be seen, to be loved, to be adored. And yeah, so that's what I'm doing right now.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, Black joy is so important to center right now. So thank you, Crystal. Preston.
Hey everyone, Preston Mitchum. I use he, him pronouns. I am Black, I'm queer, I'm intersectional, and I'm radically joyful all the time. So thank you so much for having me tonight. By way of profession, I am the director of policy with URGE. URGE is Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity. URGE is a young people's reproductive justice organization, really empowering young people in the South and the Midwest, specifically Ohio, Kansas, Georgia, Alabama, and Texas. Also, I'm an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. I'm also a nerd teaching LGBT health law and policy. So if you need any data on health disparities for queer and trans people, I'm your guy. All right, thank you so much. I'm really excited for this conversation tonight.
Thank you, Preston, so much for sharing. Amani.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Bryce. I really appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you to the fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Imani Rupert Gordon. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Executive Director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. We are a legal organization that works to protect the civil and human rights of LGBTQ folks and our families. We do this, we're primarily known for high impact litigation, but we also do legislative work, public policy, and public education. Super excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Imani, for all your critical work with NCLR. And last but not least, Tony, tell us about yourself a little bit.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tony Newman. I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm an author of the memoir, I Rise, The Transformation of Tony Newman. And I'm currently the consultant for the Transgender Strategy Center. We are a leadership group based in order to help trans groups to build upon themselves and to grow. I've been in this work for 10 years, fighting for trans equality. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for your longtime commitment to our community. And again, just like really excited to have such a diverse group of folks and really dive into this conversation. So as I mentioned earlier, I am a bit of a history nerd, and I really kind of wanted to frame this conversation around that. So, 2020 has been a really unprecedented year for both LGBTQ rights and also the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black lives. And we're really starting to see this intersectional framework really come to the forefront. And advocates like us have been talking about this for a long time, and now people kind of want to know what it's all about. And we haven't really seen this level of interest in the Black Lives Matter movement since, I would say, 2014, after the murders of both Eric Garner and Mike Brown. So we're really in this really unique moment where we're seeing a resurgence of the movement for Black lives. And of course, Pride looked really different this year because of COVID-19. And in some ways, it really made folks think more critically about what Pride looks like. And we really went back to our roots of Pride, being small community gatherings, being uprisings, being protests, being out in the streets, protesting the various injustices that we're seeing today that, quite frankly, really do mirror a lot of the injustices that we saw back in the early civil rights movement and, back during the Compton cafeteria riots here in San Francisco, and then Stonewall in New York City. So I think we're just living in a really critical, unique moment that is perfect to be having these conversations. And I'm just really excited to dive in with folks, particularly at Pride this year, for the first time ever, we saw people holding signs in masses, tens of thousands of people holding signs that said Black trans queer lives matter and Black queer lives matter. And that was, for me, a huge revolution and a huge revelation. So I just kind of want to start with that and thinking about, in this moment of intersectionality, I'm really curious to hearing from all of y'all how intersectionality really influences your work and how you think about it specifically when advocating for the rights of the Black LGBT community. I want to start with Tony on that question. Oh, having a hard time hearing you, Tony. I think you're still on mute.
Hi.
There you go.
I am, first and foremost, I always say, I'm an African-American first, and then I am a trans woman of color second. So in this movement, the Black Lives Movement, I'm fighting for Black Lives Matter equality. I'm also fighting for Black trans women of color equality. As we all know, in the LGBTQ family, the trans group, especially trans women of color, are the ones who are most marginalized and economically, not able to support themselves in a way to live as most people do. We hear that the LGBTQ is a wealthy group of individuals, but 82% of trans women of color live below the poverty line. So I just want to acknowledge and recognize that most of my people who are trans women of color are living in poverty without housing and financial resources. I'm very blessed to have climbed out of that category, but most of the people that I've known in the last 25 years of transitioning are economically disadvantaged, they're without housing. So I'm fighting on two causes on this intersectionality, as a Black person first, but also as a trans woman of color second. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And something you really stuck out with me, you said you use the word marginalized. And I think that's a word that we're going to frame tonight's conversation around a lot. So thank you for throwing that out. Would love to hear from other folks how intersectionality influences their work. Imani, would love to hear from you.
Sure, happy to talk about it. So intersectionality has really become more of a buzzword than anything else. And we've taken it to mean that that it means that it's difficult when someone's from multiple marginalized or underrepresented identities. But that's not really what an intersectional approach is. When the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, she was speaking about a particular dynamic when employment protection laws were meant to protect for race and gender and then failed to do it. And that was because of the unique ways that a Black woman, or more broadly, women of color, experience both racism and sexism simultaneously. I think it's important, it's important to frame that because we talk about this word a lot and we think that we are talking about the same thing. And I don't know that we always are. But I think really something to name here is that we're not talking about individual things. We are talking about systems, and that's a really important thing to name. This isn't about how difficult it is for any one person. It's systems that are in place that because of people's multiple underrepresented identities, they're left behind or they fall through the cracks. And so when I think about intersectional approaches, I think that this is actually how we have to highlight it, that employment protections that we were talking about, they came as an afterthought. The considerations that employment protections were, they were written specifically for Black men and specifically for white women. It wasn't intended for the Black women the Black woman that lost this case when she was suing for employment discrimination. And so, applying that now, it's important that when we talk about intersectionality, that we are highlighting the systems. We've gotten a lot of victories in our LGBTQ movement, but not everyone has been able to benefit from these victories because it to exist in the LGBTQ community. Tony was talking, transgender women of color, particularly Black trans women, are systematically and disproportionately experience violence in our community. LGBTQ folks are disproportionately incarcerated, fall into the foster care system, are more likely to interact with juvenile justice systems. There are a lot of ways that we experience drastically different and negative health outcomes. And so when I think about, what we need to do, and this is probably how everyone will answer, and really speaking to what Tony just said, but if we are caring for Black lives, then we have to center the voices of the most underrepresented, and that is Black women and other trans women of color. We must center sex workers, gig economy workers, folks with lower incomes, folks centering the voices of folks with the fewest resources and the most barriers to access. So that's what I would think about. And especially, I'll just add one last thing. Because we are right now living through a pandemic, when we talk about what it means to be intersectional in this moment, as we're considering reopening and closing and reopening cities all over this country, that we need to think about who is most affected by this, that communities are among the highest group testing positive, and Black communities are most likely to die from COVID-19 related illnesses. And so we want to think about these things. Who are being most affected? And those are the groups that we want to start with, because when we start from the people that are most affected, then everyone benefits from that. And it doesn't happen when we start from the people that are least affected and then add folks in, add protections in. Then when we do that, that's when we find out systems where, just like we were talking about earlier with the employment protections, that we found out later that these don't support folks from multiple marginalized identities.
Yeah, and thank you for really contextualizing this moment we're in with COVID, like you mentioned with COVID, and also thank you for naming the systemic root causes of a lot of inequalities and issues we're going to be talking about. We'd love to keep the conversation going if someone wants to jump in there.
Yeah, I'm really happy to dive in. Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much, Imani. And when you both were talking, I just kept thinking of Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley's quote, "People closest to the pain must be closest to the power." And we've heard different iterations of that quote, but that's something I've been thinking about. And I also really appreciate the contextualization of Kimberly Crenshaw, because oh my gosh, how many times have we heard intersectionality used incorrectly and used as a political or policy buzzword to score, points in progressive spaces, and oftentimes incorrectly. And so the graph and read, if you have not heard of the case, the graph and read, please look it up. It is the case that Imani is talking about. So thank you for that. So intersectionality is really important to advancing, obviously, the rights and dignity for Black LGBTQ people broadly. But it's really important to kind of name what that is also, because that also means we can't separate our Blackness from our queerness, from our transness, and how that actually shows up in laws and policy. And so, we can't pretend that Black, queer, and trans people are not over-policed, We can't pretend that Black and queer and trans people don't experience high health disparities. We can't pretend that Black, queer, and trans people are not being denied access to reproductive freedom, including abortion and contraception, among other things. And we can't pretend that Black, queer, and trans people are not denied housing and employment opportunities. And to be honest, will probably still continue true despite the Supreme Court's recent decision. So only through an intersectional analysis will we understand that our issues are interconnected, and through our non-siloed lived experiences. And so in my work specifically with URGE, Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, one thing that's important to mention is we cannot have a reproductive justice frame without going back to intersectionality. Reproductive justice was a term that was coined in 1994 by 12 Black women. And we know it by 4 tenets that we talk about often. The right to have a child being one. Number 2, the right to not have a child. Number 3, the right to parent the child we have in a safe environment. And number 4, the right to bodily autonomy. So why does that mean that we can't discuss reproductive justice without intersectionality? So how are we actually gonna parent the children that we have if we're dealing with police violence? How are we gonna parent the children we have in a safe environment when they're drinking from water fountain that has toxins? How are we gonna do that in Flint, Michigan, which still does not have clean water, mind you? How are we gonna do that in environments where we're actually dealing with environmental degradation, environmental catastrophes, right? So we can't have these conversations in the silo. And what intersectionality actually means is that we're able to live our experiences together without separating the important parts of ourselves.
And thank you, Preston. I really like the silo analogy, and I really excited to hear from other folks how they're breaking out of the silo and breaking out those other issues. Crew, maybe you can share about that.
Most def. I think in regards to the Black Lesbian Archives, I definitely find that, you know, our voices, when I talk about that, it's like storytelling. And what does that mean? You know what I mean? We see documentaries, we see texts and things like that. We go to different museums, we go to different institutions or wherever may have you, and we see the same people telling our stories over and over and over and over again. And I look around and I'm just like, well, where are we fitting into that scope? You know, and I think that's another reason why I'm so passionate about the work that I do, because our stories carry on from generation to generation to generation to generation. And when you are in a sense of like, you're learning from your past, you're learning and connecting these dots from like people who have done it, people who have been here already, and we're connecting those things of like, okay, this is how they've done it in the past, this is how some of the things that we've done in our present, how are we moving forward in our futures, you know? So storytelling for me in regards to intersectionality comes from telling our stories in a way that is truthful from our own experiences versus experiences of other people who feel like they know what, you know, they feel like they know what life we about, you know what I'm saying? So I just say that to say, for me, and like I said, regards into the BLA, I really truly push the narrative, and I think it's important that we know that we have so many tools out right now that we're able to share our stories. We don't need somebody else to tell us where we've been and where we're going. So I do want to note that my Egyptian ancestors, you know, my scribes, my priests, you know what I mean, and everybody who comes in to kind of be like, all right, how can we pull these together, not just from the Black lesbians, but everybody within the Black LGBT community, just to know that our stories are creating the entire scope of the narrative, y'all. You know, so if we're not sharing our stories, if we're not telling it like it is and telling the truth, it can get muddled into other things. So I think, and we'll go into this a little bit later, definitely, but yeah, that's something I do definitely want to share in regards to intersectionality and just storytelling in general. Our stories have to be told by us and continue to be told by us and shared by us and written by us and spoke by us in order for things to move and progress into the next generation. So
thank you, Kurt. And I love your focus on storytelling, and that's something we're definitely going to speak about, you know, a little later when we're thinking about historical figures that have really inspired us and connecting those stories from the past to the present and ultimately to the future. So thank you for kind of introducing that and setting that up by talking about storytelling. Kylar, and then we'll go to Crystal to wrap us up about intersectionality. Would love to hear from you, Kylar.
You know, there's so many great things that have been said about intersectionality and, you know, where it started, but it is very important. And we look at, I'll just say, trans visibility. And first of all, I guess I'll start with the thought of starting with the most marginalized, and that's the floor, you know, the bottom. If we don't start with the people at the bottom and bring the people up, correct, it doesn't benefit anybody if we don't start there with the most marginalized of our communities. And I agree that I always get irritated when I hear intersectionality thrown around at conferences, because it is thrown around and it's never discussed in the correct context or understanding. But just talking about it in general, we have to bring all of ourselves to where we are and where we're going. Kylar is a Black man. That's clear in the movement that we live in. And Kylar is also a trans man. Those things have to go hand in hand because that's who I am. Kylar also brings with him disabilities that Kylar has and other features that Kylar has. All of that cannot be separated. So when I come, I bring all of me. Now, what society might see is only a portion of me as a Black man, because I had blended and I blend. I look just like my father and my male cousins. So then we have to deal with all those parsing outs of me as I go through society and how I have been treated and am treated. For example, not using any particulars, but it always bothers me to be on LGBTQ boards as a Black trans man, because I don't get the same respect I get on other boards. And that's interesting because a lot of it, in my opinion, has to do with race and how we operate within the confines of this LGBTQ movement. And we want to relegate it to it's just a certain class of people. And I'll bring out, you know, anti-Blackness that we never want to talk about or deal with in the LGBT movement, or actually in America in general. We say racism, but we never want to talk about anti-Blackness, which I feel permeates within the LGBT movement. And I always talk about it. And that's why I'm one of the most beloved people, tongue in cheek, in the movement, because I push those envelopes and talk about it and put it on the table. Because quite frankly, in the way the movement is framed, I still feel like that 20-year-old Black person that says I shouldn't join this movement. And I've been a part of this movement, and I still come out feeling the same way, because there's a lot of misunderstanding of who I am and what I bring to this movement and how I'm treated within this movement. There are only certain people that are Black and are of a particular color and that are allowed to climb in this movement. And I'm a threat because I bring truth and authenticity no matter what room I'm in and who I'm talking to. Because, you know, I used to write checks in corporate America that are larger than a lot of these budgets of organizations, but I'm taken as a threat to a lot of these organizations just because of who I am and how I handle myself. So bottom line is that I don't think very many people of color, of any color in this movement have gotten what they've needed in this movement. And we don't ever have those talks. We want to say, well, I'm the most marginalized. Well, we can talk to lots of people in this LGBTQ construct of whiteness, and lots of people haven't gotten their due. We can start with Black lesbians as number one. And they'll have a whole lot to say because they've never gotten their due. And we can just go on down the line from there, and all the letters from on down haven't gotten their due. So we need to have real discussions in this LGBTQ construct that talk about what's really going on, and if we want real intermeshing of people, because I don't see it. And I continue to speak that when I talk on panels, that we talk all these great theories, but where does the rubber meet the road? And we hire, and I'm gonna stop because I know I'm over time, but we hire leaders and we replace older leaders because we say, oh, well, Kyler's telling us the truth. So we definitely don't want to put him in a position of power, because we want to replace him with other people that are not in the know until they discover our stuff. And then we keep changing out Black people. And that's what we do in this movement. And I know you asked me about intersectionality, but this has all to do with that, because then they keep putting in unknown and unsuspecting Black people, so we never get to deal with the issues in this movement. And then we create the scarcity models in play of I'm not getting enough, when in reality, nobody is getting enough in this movement of the LGBT movement that's not created by us, for us, or really honestly to be inclusive of us. So that's why these things are great to have, and these conversations are great to have, and the things that I convene. And that's why I started Trans People of Color Coalition when we didn't know if there were 10, people of color of any color way back in the day. And thank goodness that has changed and multiplied, because I came out in the day where people didn't even say transgender out loud, and there were few of us, and you risked your life, all of us did, by walking out on the street, and I came out in a territory where guns were held and pointed at you, but we had ourselves, and that was just it. So I'll wrap there, because I know I've gone over in saying that I appreciate Amani's analysis of what intersectionality was meant to mean. And then I get tired of the conversations and hearing people talk about they don't understand it, when we're just talking about everybody bringing them their full authentic selves to a movement and to be respected for all of themselves. And we still can't do that in this movement. And we really can't do it around authentic Blackness in the LGBT movement. I can't hear you, Bryce. You're muted.
I appreciate, sorry about that, everybody watching. I really appreciate kind of where you end it in terms of the idea of bringing your authentic self, right? And everyone has that right. Everyone deserves that space. And Kyler, just really appreciate your framing of anti-Blackness and calling that out specifically. And I think it is really important, as Amani was naming systems, and as Tony was naming the specific struggles of trans women of color, that we are very specific about naming the systems and naming the barriers that are at play and at work and up against all of us. So Crystal, last but not least, would love to just hear your take about how you see intersectionality really impacting your work.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for what you all had to say. I would just like to add, from my point of view, when I first got into activism, I kind of got into activism working with ACT UP here in San Francisco. And I have to say, one of the things that I really learned from being in ACT UP is the importance of intersectionality. I remember having conversations in rooms with white gay men who would remind us from time to time of how many people had died while we were discussing something. And I always just thought to myself, and sometimes I said it out loud, people in my community have been dying. And so it kind of starts with there for me. And then through the years, right, I'm thinking about after Clinton came into office and after their medications were available for HIV and AIDS, and a lot of the energy was sort of lost. And then it's sort of suddenly it was all about gay marriage, right? And I'm thinking to myself, well, what good is gay marriage gonna do me if me and my partner poor as fuck, sorry about the cursing, y'all, and we could, and because I look like a dude to so many people, my ass can get killed in the middle of the street. So, so I have often brought that with me into rooms. And then I had the experience of working on issues of police brutality and ending up in rooms that were mostly cis, mostly heterosexual, and being looked at a little bit like suspect, right? So that also goes back to what people are talking about. And for me, one of the things I feel is very important about what's going on today And one of the reasons I actually turned to arts and arts administration is because I felt and continue to feel that need, that we have to be able to bring our whole ass selves to this movement. And if we want to like be successful, and if we want this movement to keep going on, we have to, because I can't tell you how exhausting and draining it is to try to figure out who I should bring into the room tonight.
Yes. That really resonates with me a lot, as someone else who is also like a Black queer trans person, right? Like I definitely feel that anxiety a lot about, okay, can I be Black in this space? Can I be queer in this space? Can I be trans in this space? And I think what's so beautiful about the work that you all are doing is that you're really building spaces where people can bring their full selves. And really on that note, thinking about how we're all doing this work building spaces where folks can bring their full selves. You know, Kylar mentioned this a bit in his answer, thinking about the history, and Crystal, you did as well a little bit about how that wasn't always the case, right? Historically, there have not been a lot of spaces for folks that look like us and folks with our experiences. But luckily for all of us, there were a few brave trailblazers who really did lead the way and really did lay the foundation for the work that we're all doing now. So for example, when I think about an LGBTQ person who really influenced my work, I think about James Baldwin a lot. As someone who's an educator and a writer, Baldwin has always kind of been really my anchor as like a Black queer man. And I've learned a lot from him. So I would really love to hear from folks about who that person is for you, or that group of people is for you, who really inspires you from history, that keeps you going in the hard times, that you've learned from in this work. If we could start with Amani, I would love that.
Sure, happy to do it. So for me, I think, the person I will always name is Angela Davis. And it's because I see something really beautiful happening right now. Well, today I'm gonna, because I see something beautiful happening right now. This is something, the idea of defunding, the idea of prison abolition, this is something that she said could happen. And I remember the first time I saw the Black Power mixtape. It's this documentary about Angela Davis, and we speak to her while she's locked up, and she just has this swag about her, and it's the kind of swag you have when you're brilliant and you're angry and you're right and you know you are. And I just love seeing that. She's older now and she's more poised and she smiles because they're young people that have learned from her. But back to this mixtape, she talks about the ways that her father kept her community safe and how her neighbors' fathers kept their community safe. And you see her understanding of safety is grounded in what she knows is right. Because for some of us, the presence of police have not always provided safety or protection. For some of us, policing and then the subsequent incarceration is the diametric opposite of safety. So in many communities, a system of policing is what perpetuates cycles of poverty and the lower than average health outcomes. And once you're locked up, your earning potential goes down. And we know that these correlates to health outcomes and the correlation between health outcomes and income levels. So just the bravery to say that you know what safety is and what it isn't when no one else is saying that, I just think is brilliant. But why I would name her today is the traction that we're seeing in the defund movement. It was not that long ago, even a few months ago, where the idea of defunding the police was something that very few people would consider. And now it's this large growing movement, and we're seeing how it plays out in real life. And this isn't about, if you believe in this or not, but my interest in this is because she was able to see something. She was able to be creative and think about a future that we hadn't seen before. And that is brilliant to me because I go to work every single day. I dedicate my life and my career into believing in a world that I haven't seen yet. And sometimes that is hard to believe. But during times like that, I'm thankful for the people that have had the creative capacity, like Angela Davis, to see something that we've never seen. And it's my hope that I can be a bit better at that and become a bit more like her. And then lastly, I just want to add that I'm also enamored with this grace that she shows as well. During the last election cycle, she announced that she was voting for Hillary Clinton, and so many young folks were saying, basically, wow, you can't be our leader then. And instead of telling her that, you know, this is how she's thinking about harm reduction as she saw it, or, you know, and this is a better use of her time, what she said was, she said, you know, I don't have anything to say to that. I remember when I was a young person and I didn't like it when older people taught me how to think. And I love having that perspective that when you're younger, you have this expectation, but then when you get older, that you remember that as well. And I just the way that she has just moved through the world and our movement, it just makes me want to be better.
Yeah, and I really like what you said about how she had the creativity to kind of imagine, you know, 30 years ago, quite frankly, this future that we're not building for ourselves. And I think the best historical figures, the best leaders are also like the best imaginers and the people who have that big picture thinking and can really be creative. So thank you. Preston, would love to jump in. Who's kind of your person or your group of people that really keep you going in the hard moments?
Because I'm queer and I like to break rules, I'll say that I'm gonna have two. So one is a group, and then one is an individual person. So the group that I consistently want to uplift is the Black Panther Party, frankly, consistently. So part of this is like, there's obviously like this terrible framing from many people around the Black Panther Party. But for folks who actually have studied and know the Black Panther Party, we already know just exactly who they were and what they did. I mean, they fed the community. They actually supported queer people in many ways. They believed in protecting the community without police, without prisons, without understanding without mass incarceration for Black people especially. And they believed in safety and freedom, right? Like, and connected to Imani's point about Angela Davis, like that is the thing that we're talking about. Actually, so when we talk about defunding, we're really talking about safety and freedom. We're really talking about like re-envisioning public safety, re-envisioning the world, providing resources to people and communities. So crime, whatever the concept of crime mean, wouldn't exist in the first place, right? So that is actually what we're talking about. You know, in literally every state in the country, there is a law on the book that actually is around criminalizing sex workers. Every single state in the country, right? So when you think about that, when you think about why people engage in sex work, right? Of course, there are some people who are like, you know what? I'm good at sex. I'm gonna get money for it. I'm good. I'm about that life, right? We should celebrate those people too. There are also people who are actually forced into underground economies. Why? Because they're discriminated against, right? Because they're exploited in many ways, because they're of trans experience and people don't want to hire them, because they're queer and people don't want to hire them. But we don't want to talk about those intersectional conversations, right? There's like an automatic disparagement happens. And I think organizations like the Black Panther Party understood that disparagement happened and actually made sure to create a space that felt safe and brave for people to just be.
Yes.
The person who I deeply, deeply admire, and I'm almost in shock even how many lawyers don't talk about this brave woman, is Reverend Dr. Polly Murray. An unsung heroine of the civil rights movement, a lawyer, a writer, an organizer, a legal theorist. Her scholarship is really, I should say, groundbreaking, because so she created and informed so many civil rights strategies. And honestly, a lot of the white feminists who we dedicate like so many things to actually should be given to Polly Murray. And so, you know, even when she was at Howard, like one of the things she talked about was she coined the term Jane Crow. So of course we heard about, you know, the Jim Crow laws and what that actually meant for the segregated South. But she really urged the movement and religious leaders especially to fight both racism and sexism. And so because of that, right, we think about intersectionality, but she was really naming 30, 40 years ago, like, y'all, guess what happens to Black women? They experience racism and sexism. And as a Black woman, I'm gonna name that. And also, I'm a queer Black woman, so I'm gonna name also how homo antagonism plays into this too. And so, you know, so she was brilliant. She was such a brilliant Black woman, Black queer woman who was ahead of her time in many ways. And I just wanna celebrate her so much in this moment. So Reverend Dr. Polly Murray, 100%.
Yes, and going back to the Black Panther Party, I think the Black Panther Party really exemplified intersectionality back in the day before it was a popular term or before it was a popular notion, right? And thinking about what Kylar was saying earlier about how he's also he's also disabled, and that's a part of his identity as well. And when you were talking, Preston, I was thinking about how the Black Panther Party actually fed disability activists here in Oakland and in the San Francisco Bay Area during the Section 504 protests, which was back in the 70s 40s, I believe, and the Black Panther Party literally fed disabled protesters who occupied a federal building in the SF Bay Area for weeks in order to advocate for their disability rights. And a lot of queer folks are part of that group as well. So I was just thinking of all of that while y'all were talking. And Kylar, since I mentioned your name, would love to kind of hear who your person is or who really inspires you from history.
Sorry, trying to unmute here. Well, I'm even more difficult than Preston because I have trouble choosing any 1, 2, or 3 people.
I know there's so many options. There's so many good options. Right. But like if you had to choose one.
There's so many to choose from, and honestly, some were not queer that I know of. We'll put it that way, because that's the other thing. But if I had to, and you still, James Baldwin sang to me. He rang to me. His writing rang to me. When I read James Baldwin for the first time, I found my heart and soul. People don't realize I'm truly an introvert because they see me on talk mode on these things. But as soon as these buttons go off, and spend a day with me, you'll know I'm an introvert. So I don't really normally have a lot to say. But when I can find something that I can connect with like that in a writing, and it sang to me, and music is something that's very important to me. I'm actually a musician and was supposed to be by trade, but the trans thing, and ended up doing something else. And so music is still a very integral part of my life. And so I translate things into music, or music translates to me. So there are probably musicians also that more or less sang to me as well as James Baldwin. But I'll say this: James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, and his writing also, the tone of it, how it spoke to me about Blackness. But what really influenced me more were the reports of all the imprisonment and honestly living through the 60s as a child, and being influenced by the civil rights era itself and the way I saw our people treated, and being a late child of parents that lived through, and I still call it slavery, because it was slavery. I like how we put nice little words on things, but it was slavery. And, my parents hid a lot from us and the things they endured. But we can call it separate but equal. We can call it whatever. And I saw signs. I luckily went to a desegregated school, but my sister endured the other experience, and I had to endure some of that too. Seeing the Negro sign, I remember being 5 and seeing that when I went to the drugstore with her, and somebody's big white hand in my face. And I still remember that moment, and I'm certainly not 5, and having the hand put in my face. So writers of that time and the Harlem Renaissance, all of that is what influenced me. And I get rather romantic about it because the musicians of that time as well, with bebop, Duke Ellington, and all of those musicians with the big swing bands. And I know you didn't ask for that, but they did influence me, and that's what influenced me and influences me. I know people have this box all wrong, but it just depends on where you meet the box, and you get the rest, because you've been with the box, so you know that there's more to the box.
And I love what you're talking about in terms of artists, right? And we have a couple artists on this panel tonight who are going to speak more about what art means to their work and how art influences their work.
Exactly.
And one of them, Crystal, you're an artist, and I'm curious, if who your influence is, if they're an artist or more of a thinker, philosopher, who really inspires your work, Crystal?
Well, when I think about it, I've been thinking about that for a few days, and I came up with 2 things, and one of them is the whole group of the Combahee River Collective, because for me, that's where I got to start thinking about we can do something different here, that it doesn't have to be like this. They were some of the first people I heard talk about like the intersections, and one of the reasons why like the white feminist movement didn't work for them, and why also a lot of the Black Power movement stuff didn't work for them, and why they and how they actually articulated something different and something more. And they were also some of the first people to talk about the fact that when Black women are free, and I think they meant all women, then we'll all be free, because that would mean that we have dismantled white supremacy and capitalism and the systems that keep us down. They keep all of us down, really. And so I was very influenced by that. And also I was influenced by, when I heard people talking about like James Baldwin, I was influenced by Lorraine Hansberry, because I believe that she deeply influenced James Baldwin and asked a lot of the right questions to get him thinking more intersectionally. And also because she was an artist and she understood the importance of Black people talking to the Black experience. And she understood like there were stories we had to tell. And sometimes we had to wash our dirty laundry in public to bring all of us along. And to me, I feel like that connects so deeply to this moment, because I'll say two things. One thing was, doing all this stuff after the George Floyd murder, one of the things that knocked me the lowest was hearing on the news about protesters in Minneapolis beating up a Black trans woman. That tore me apart, because I just said to myself, man, we ain't gonna ever get free if we can't do better than this, right? And then the other thing was like going out to a demo and hearing like young people who were leading this demo in front of Mission High School here in San Francisco. And it was young Black kids and other kids of color, and to hear them talk about intersectionality, to hear them be so inclusive of trans lives, of disabled lives, and of the notion that we don't get free by leaving people behind. And see, I mean, and for me, that's important, because I feel like I learned that being an activist. I saw that firsthand. I saw like Black trans and gay people be left behind by the AIDS activist movement. I saw people in prison being left behind by the activist movement. One of our main things when we began in ACT UP was a call for universal health care. That was one of our main pegs, right? And the other one was chosen family, the idea of chosen family. And all of that got left by the wayside. So so I'm like very influenced by those two people. And artistically, you know, I was really influenced by like the Harlem Renaissance, like a lot of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the reasons why an organization like Queer Rebel is like so important is because they tried to erase us out of the Harlem Renaissance. They tried to erase us out of all movements, basically. They've tried to erase queers out of like the civil rights movement. And like, you know, and I have to say, like I said before, like, you know, that also weakens us, and it weakens our movement, because we need more, and we need us to be able to step up and to keep stepping up. We also need to be able to take a step back and rest and know that other people will be still doing this work, right? So also like Queer Rebel is intergenerational. I live in a 13-person intergenerational co-op. So my life is really about like intersectionality and realizing that, you know, this work is going to take all of us doing all kinds of things, you know, and I feel like art is important and healing is important. And I feel like those two things go together.
Yes, and we'll for sure talk more about art and healing later, Crystal. So like, thank you for introducing that to the conversation. And also thank you for like hitting on storytelling again, and just like, I just want to really ground this conversation and ground tonight's event. And like, we're all here to like share our stories and really talk about, like as Crew said earlier, which I'm going to pass off to Crew in a second. As Crew said earlier, we should be telling our own stories. So we'd love to hear from Crew, who their historical figure is, and then we'll end with Tony on that question.
Most def, I do got about three.
Let's try to like pick like your favorite person,
I'm gonna pick
number
one.
one.
But I'm gonna pick one, but I'm gonna give a shout out to two. So I want to give a shout out to Lynn over at the Bay Area Lesbian Archives, and also the whole Ashe collective in the Bay Area. I've been studying up on them. It's pretty dope movement. But the person that I actually want to highlight is Bernita Gray from Chicago. That's my girl. I'm always, anytime anybody asks me about a trailblazer, she is the one that I will continue to tell a story, even though she is passed. She is a super feisty Sagittarius, activism, heavily into, politics and things. And one thing of her story she had in this book called From Woodstock to the White House. She used to have this home that people who were getting kicked out of her homes, and kind of to piggyback off of what Crystal said, like your chosen family, right? So people were getting kicked out of their homes at this time. So she opened her home up to everybody. And there was literally stories about like people sleeping in the bathtub, you know what I mean? Because it was just so many people in the home. She had a hotline. So people were like, attempting suicide or like, you know what I mean? Or trying to, having some personal, emotional issues. They could call that line and talk to her. She was actually on the FBI list for that. That's a whole nother story. And also an event that her and a couple of friends put on at University of Chicago. And I think I brought up at the University of Chicago. And at that time that they put that event on, nobody had any events for people within the LGBTQ plus community at all. And they were like, well, I mean, we want to know who's at the school. We want to know who's not only at the school, but just the community around the University of Chicago. So they threw this party and everybody from all sides just came out to this party. And it just kind of shows you how, just by taking that risk, we talk about trailblazers, just taking a risk to just see what's what and being able to, connect and communicate with people who are like you, and share some of the same interests. So definitely Bernita Gray. Definitely shout out to Bernita Gray.
Thank you. And I like how you ended up thinking about risks, right? And I think all of y'all have really touched on this with the figures and with the groups that you talked about. All of those people, all those organizations were taking big risks in doing the work they were doing. So I really like that you included that crew. Tony, would love to hear from you about like, who's that risk taker? Who's that trailblazer for you that's really inspired your work?
It's going to be different, but in 1981, I met Dr. Maya Angelou when I was a freshman at Wake Forest University. And her work and her poetry and I Rise, and it just touched me so. I had conversations with her then, but it was 25 years later that I wrote a book about my own journey and used her poem, I Rise, to add to the transformation of Tony Newman based on the experiences I had with her in the 80s. I was from North Carolina, a rural area. I was a gay boy, and I mentioned to her in the 80s, I think I'm a woman. And she said, then you a Black queen. You a Black ocean. And don't never let anyone tell you that you are not a queen and a goddess made by God. So through my 20 years of working in corporate and being an ED and an executive director and being the only Black in the room, the only Black trans in the room, the only Black trans woman of color in the room, that's always stood with me that I am a queen. And whether you like what I have to say or not, it is important, not only to me, but to God. And I've studied that. I've studied her work quite a bit. And in 2012, she and I interviewed together on Huffington Post, and I about wet in my pants. So excited that 25 years later, she's saying, this is what happens when you rise. This is how you do it, baby. This is how we did it in the 60s. And it just made me feel so good. So she's always stuck with me. Now, a trans group that I would like to enlighten, I guess in the last 15 years, is the Transgender Law Center. I'm from a legal background, studying law. And I think the only way to get equality for any marginalized group is through the law. When it's on the books and it's legal, no one can discriminate against you when you have the law saying that this is the way it should be. So I highlight them, I support them very much so, because transgender equality won't come without laws, especially now. We need it more than ever. Since HUD is turning them away in the shelters, you need laws. You need someone
Yes.
to come in and reverse those laws that Donald Trump has put on the books to hurt a 1% marginalized group. We make up such a small population, and it seems to be a direct attack on trans folk. And it baffles me why he's so concerned about us, wanting to harm us, but we are kings and queens. And just like the ocean, we shall rise. So there we go.
Well, Tony, I now have to add you to my list of LGBTQ trailblazers because I myself am actually also from North Carolina. So I appreciate your leadership being a fellow Southern Black queer trans person. So thank you so much. And, you know, one thing that really you're talking about that really just resonated with me and I want to highlight, and it's kind of the perfect segue, honestly, is thinking about the law, right? And thinking about legal systems. And now I really want to have a chance to kind of hear from folks about like some specific topics. I apologize, I can never say the word specific. Some specific topics that we really do see kind of bubbling to the surface right now and that we do see really relevant. And Preston, I wanted to start with you on this question. And again, like perfect setup, Tony, so thank you. You know, Preston, you also have a legal background and you're an amazing reproductive rights advocate and just a policy expert and just an out loud Black queer person. And there has been a lot of legal action happening. A few of y'all have referenced the Supreme Court case last month, which protected LGBT people in employment after a 25, 30-year battle with that. And I'm really curious, kind of, Preston, what you see as next on the legal landscape from like a policy perspective, but also like community organizers, like what should they be thinking about right now in terms of policy and law?
Sure. So this is something that Imani already talked about in detail, and I want to just add a little bit more to it, because when I think about like really what's on the horizon and the landscape, really at the intersections of grassroots organizing and policy, it is defunding the police. And so, excuse me, and I want to be very clear, right? So not only defunding the police, but specifically thinking about the intersections of reproductive justice, state violence, and state violence, right? Like those two things, which are oftentimes not really seen in that way, or at least spoken about in that way, to me are things that are on the horizon and are obviously happening. So what are we talking about? We're talking about institutionalized violence, including targeted divestment of resources from Black and Brown communities, from clinic closures and lack of access to clinic-based abortion care. We're talking about the risk of being over-policed and surveilled for people self-managing their own abortions. We're talking outside of a clinic setting, I should say. We're talking about prosecutions for self-managing your abortion and how that disproportionately impacts Black people, including Black, queer, and trans folks, who obviously face higher rates of arrest for suspected abortion or pregnancy loss. We're talking about Black people who are forced to have more interactions with law enforcement and state agents, such as social workers even, because of negative pregnancy outcomes caused by health disparities, not something that's magically created. And so that's why I deeply believe that the most pressing issue for us in the legal landscape, but really, really at the core intersection of grassroots organizing and policy advocacy is the intersections of reproductive justice and state violence. And it goes back to the entire concept and the reason why we're having this conversation around intersectionality, and that we cannot have reproductive justice, right? And we're not just talking about abortion access. We're not just talking about contraception and birth control. We're talking about the intersections of economic justice, of birth control, of abortion access, of immigrant justice, of democracy reform and voting justice, of avoiding police systems, right? And that's only possible with defunding the police. And so for sure, I think there are many things on the horizon, but the one thing that I think is really on the horizon, of course, that we name, but always want to make the implicit explicit, is defunding the police and really the intersection of RJ, reproductive justice, and state violence and mass incarceration.
Yeah, and thank you for uplifting that. I think a lot of times trans folks in particular get left out of the conversation around reproductive health and reproductive justice. So I really appreciate you uplifting that and thinking about state violence right now and defunding the police. I agree that is like a really huge core issue. So thank you for sharing expertise about that. And, on top of defunding the police, a lot of folks have alluded to this in the conversation already about employment, right? And economic, and the economic disparity that a lot of Black, queer, trans folks face that a lot of BIPOC people in the LGBT community face, because, you know, they oftentimes we are discriminated against in the workplace. And, you know, as Preston talked about, a lot of folks are forced into sex work or are forced into some sort of underground economy to make up for the fact that we are discriminated against in employment. And I know recently the Supreme Court case was a really big win for a lot of folks, and a lot of folks really celebrated that. But I also want to put into context that it is still going to be incredibly challenging for a lot of Black, queer, trans folks in particular to access the economy, to access traditional jobs, particularly in COVID-19 when unemployment is incredibly high and companies are laying off people. So I say all that to say, you know, Kylar, I know you have a lot of experience in this field thinking about employment non-discrimination, also experiencing it yourself, unfortunately, as so many others like myself have experienced it. And would just kind of love to hear some thoughts from you about the recent Supreme Court case last month, and you know, in terms of for Black trans folks in particular, thinking about employment, kind of like what they should be thinking about or how it is navigating those spaces.
I heard you coming for me, Bryce. I turned on my mic. You know, while it's a great victory, and it is one we've worked hard to gain as organizers, as activists, as attorneys over the years. You know, I've been in strategy sessions, in writing sessions, in legal sessions, and, you know, my colleagues, you know, have carried the ball over the finish line, and it is one we should be thankful for because it helps us in a lot of ways. And it was one we were extremely worried about and biting our nails because it went to a very conservative Supreme Court, and none of us wanted it there except for the people that put it there, we'll say that. As we were concerned that it was there and we didn't know what was going to happen. But we lucked out and we got a good ruling, which helps us in many areas besides employment that it backs up. Saying all of that, we got a judgment. And I don't want to sound dismissive, but, you know, as a lawyer would say, and I am one, we always tell clients it's not that judgment was easy to get. We can get a judgment, but then after the judgment, what is next? So then we have to change the culture, and we have to implement that judgment. So because we have a judgment against racism, you know, or discrimination based on race. But do we still have that? Yes, we do. So those are the things we have to talk about, is implementation of then that from the point on. And some people will comply with that and some people won't. We're seeing the country for the first time in this condition, where it was, you know, I would say economically, we're in the Great Depression. Politically, we're almost in a civil war, to be quite frank. So we are teeter-tottering in a very different place. But we've got some protections. We have had Mr. Trump in the White House rolling back things, but they still don't stand against the judgment that was entered by the Supreme Court. Yeah. So while he is doing those things, those are illegal and those are not the law. What the Supreme Court has ruled is the law. Does that make Black and brown trans lives better immediately? Frankly, no, it does not. You know, sorry to borrow Ronald Reagan's terms of trickle down, but the trickle is going to be slow, if at all impactful. We saw the job ratings come in because we no longer have Obama job ratings coming in. We have Trump numbers coming in and COVID numbers coming in. And so bottom line is, without me taking up a lot of time of talking about, you know, one, we can't go back to old jobs that don't help the economy, that have already been outsourced overseas. those jobs just aren't here. We have to find jobs that people can do. And then getting down to trans people is even more difficult because, you know, I'm finding, and I've always advised people on jobs, that if you got a job as a trans person, you better keep it, even if you're experienced it at my age, because it's difficult to move careers. And then I'm finding many young trans people, which I try to help get jobs as well, you know, that can't get a job. And so this still plagues our community, because I know my generation was the out class, so to speak, and many of us are still unemployed. We're never employed and employable, and still unemployed, and then it still goes down. And you know, Amani said something earlier, envisioning this movement. We had envisioned a lot of things when we decided to be visible and come out and not live the old way of blending in society. We didn't envision a lot of great things that have happened within our lifetimes, and we didn't think those things would happen. But some things we didn't envision that have negatively happened, and that's that some change hasn't happened fast enough, and that I see the same bigotry occur to young people that has occurred for me, because I lived my life out and visible so that wouldn't happen to you. And I see that happening to you, and you know that, and I see that happening to you, and that breaks my heart. So while we have the ruling, we still have a lot of education to do. On the other hand, Fortune 500 companies have been ahead of the courts already, because there was lots of education done. They wanted to do the right thing, so they were already ahead of the courts. They didn't want to be sued. So I will say that as a positive note, that there was already lots of work being done in corporate America ahead of time, and they were already ahead of this ruling, because they were already ahead of nonprofits, quite frankly, in their laws. But we still have lots of work to do, and we got to roll up our sleeves and do that work. But we're in this moment of where this is important also about race and getting it right in this country, and that also goes back to the multipleness of our ourselves, not multiple personalities, but that we are, you know, Black, and we're also trans, and
thinking about identities.
Yeah, the multiple identities, and we have to deal with that. And we need our Black people to wake up to that too, that, you know, we've always been in communities. It's just that we've taken on different names, and I won't go into the whole history that's, you know, that as well. But we've always been here in our communities, and it's changed since we've taken on these new European names, quite frankly, because you know, that whole historical thing that we could talk about in communities where we used to not be disrespected, but we are disrespected now. But we've been Black, so we are part of that community. So a little bit more than you asked me for, but I hope I answered.
I mean, yeah, and I really feel like what you said about implementation, right? Like, as a former policy wonk myself, policy nerd, that was something that I always really focused on, was like passing a policy is quite frankly the really easy part. The hard part really is implementation. So I really appreciate you highlighting that aspect, and I think it's something for our viewers to keep in mind as we do see like the rapid speed of progress in the courts and the rapid speed of progress in state legislators, just to understand that there is a gap there for implementation. And I think, you know, Kylar, you referenced something Amani said earlier, and I want to go to Amani now, thinking about like the role of Black women right now, right? And this is also something that the various panelists have brought up on tonight's conversation, is that oftentimes Black women, whether they're lesbians or of trans experience, are really left out of these conversations, Amani. And I know you've dedicated a lot of your work to centering the voices of Black women in the queer community in particular. And I would just like love to hear more about that, and like how you really see the role of Black queer women and Black trans women in this moment right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, lots to say. Black LGBTQ women, femmes, are the folks leading these critical movements right now. When we think about what our progressive movements are, the movement for Black lives, BYP 100, the Me Too movement, these are led by Black women, and primarily LGBTQ women. And I said before that we need to center the voices of Black trans women, the most underrepresented in our movement. We have to center these voices. But it's important that in a time like this, I think this actually, and I really want to spend some time with this. I think it's really important that even if you're not fully on board with these movements, it's important now that you get out of the way and let folks have their time. Because you have to remember that our civil rights movement has been long and it's been led by many people. My favorite Bayard Rustin quote, he was a leader of the trade union movement and then also in the LGBTQ movement. And this quote is, "You have to join every other movement for the freedom of people." And I love that. I think it's beautiful, but he said this knowing that many prominent civil rights leaders wouldn't meet with him publicly because he was gay.
Yes.
We've always had internal struggles about the best way to get to our collective liberation. And it's always taken all of us to get there. It's been our political figures and our after-school coaches. It's been the advocates, and it's been the activists. The injustices that bring people to the streets, they're there because they are looking for structural change. The things that start in the streets are the things that end in the courts. And every single issue is an LGBTQ issue. And what we can do when we listen to these Black women that are leading us right now is that even if it's not your way, these moments don't come every day. And for the folks that have risked their lives to be in the streets during a pandemic, to save our lives, like, there's work that folks put in here. And so I think it's important that we listen to Black LGBTQ women, especially that are leading right now. And that's even if you're not quite on board with that, you're not really sure, like, honestly, this is a moment that that folks are listening to, like, that we've thought about this, we've talked about it in different ways, and I think that folks deserve a moment. We all are getting there in different ways, and this is one way to get there, and I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Amani. And I really appreciate what you said about getting out of the way, right? I think that's a good reminder too, like, even for those of us who are not, who are in the movement, but who identify as masculine or identify as men, for us to make space too, right? For us to step back and make space for our trans sisters, for our queer Black sisters, and giving them a platform and giving them a stage. And Tony, that's something I want to talk to you about more and hear your perspective, because I know you're a trans woman of color who's been in the trenches for 20 plus years, and you've really done the work on so many levels, from the grassroots to courtrooms, to boardrooms. So I really would just love for you to kind of share more about that, and thinking about trans women in particular right now. Like, what can we do to show up for y'all? What can we do to make space for y'all?
Listen, Kylar brought this up. Trans women of color are your bottom. We're on the bottom. So unless you can lift the bottom up, how can the whole community be whole? We need to really reach out to our trans women of color and really show support. Housing, jobs, a lot of them are not educated, but they're getting turned down for basic jobs just because of who they are. So my thing is asking the community, and I always say this, actions speak louder than words. Don't tell me that you support me. Don't tell me that you love me. I should say that I got that from my partner. He says actions speak louder than words. If you love someone, you show them you love them. And I think the trans community, we get a lot of lip service. We get a lot of, I support you, but we're still on the bottom. And this is going on decades. We're still fighting for basic human rights, just for basic human rights, just to be treated fairly in our jobs, at healthcare, and in other sectors. So I would say, if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, show me your love. Show the trans community your love by supporting trans organizations, by supporting trans individuals, not just trans women of color, our trans men, our white trans brothers and sisters, the whole community, if you really love them. Now, keep in mind that our white brothers and sisters who are trans have a little leg up. Their families seem to stick around a lot longer. They seem to be more supportive and have financial means, much more so someone like me who comes from a middle-class family who's extremely religious. It took 15 years to even speak again once I departed and made my journey. That is the story, if we're going to do storytelling, of trans people. We have to walk away and walk alone. So where's the love? If you love us, show us you love us by your support, by your funding, by bringing us to boardrooms, by giving us those jobs of managers and directors.
Yes.
That's what love looks like.
Thank you. And Tony, I think what you're really speaking to is being an accomplice versus an ally, right? So I know allyship's like a very popular concept, a very popular term.
And I hate it. I
hate it too. Yeah, me too.
I even said that in a meeting with Mayor Breed. I'm like, I don't need an ally.
Yes.
Show me you love me.
You.
She gave us $2.3 million for housing, and she said, take it, girl, go.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about.
Yes, you're talking about active accomplishment.
Everyone says, I'm your ally. Oh, we support you. But nothing gets done. Nothing happens. So show me that you love us by your actions instead of your words.
That call to action is just like so beautiful and really resonates with me. And yeah, you're talking about accomplishment, right? And I like how you brought up budgets and money. And something I always say is like budgets are moral documents, right? So whether you're working with city leaders, whether you're working with nonprofit folks, whether you're working with companies and corporations and those Fortune 500 companies that, you know, now are really jumping on the bandwagon of intersectionality and jumping on the bandwagon of supporting Black lives. Like, if you really are down for the cause, I 100% agree. Like, you have to fund us and not only put us in spaces where we are leaders, where we are directors, where we are managers, but actually foster an environment where we could do the work, right? And give us the tools and resources. So thank you for highlighting that, Tony. And, you know, crew, a lot of what we've been talking about is, you know, really historical and really monumental, all the work that folks are being done right now. And something I think about a lot as a historian and as a former high school teacher is just how we're documenting all this, right? Like, how are we capturing this beautiful, messy, amazing, incredible, weird moment in history and time that we're living in, so that the folks who come after us you know, really learn and really grow. And that one day, you know, people can say, oh, like, Preston did this one day, you know, Crew did that, Amani did that. Like, how are we really capturing that work? And I would love to hear about like your experience as an archivist and some of the things you're thinking about in terms of historical memory, documenting this.
Oh, most def. My head has actually been spinning from all of this stuff that's going on. I'm not even gonna lie to you. I've actually had to take, you know, just a seat back or a step back and really understand like the direction that not only the BLA will go, but just in terms of what I like to call experimental archiving will go and for our communities. I've seen a lot of grassroots organizations, which has been dope, pop up, you know, in, you know, archiving and things like that throughout this time. And I think it's incredible. And I'm also in a place of like understanding what we do have control of in our communities, and what we don't have control of, or what we've been kind of falling short on. And I say that to say the internet, talking about the internet, and also talking about in terms of physical archiving and digital archiving. I talked to Lee about this, and I talked to, I don't know if it's Charlie or Charles, this is one of them, but shout out to y'all. We had a conversation about this briefly not too long ago, and we're talking about building systems that are separate from the systems that we see from our internet providers in order to share sources of information to different people around the world. And also physical archiving. You know, there's a part of me, even though I'm all for moving into the future and being able to have this at a level of where it's available for people all over, I'm also very traditional in the sense of I feel like there's something, we were talking about this, there's something so intimate about being able to hold, you know, these original documents, you know, and being able to feel it and being able to, you know, just go through it. You know, we do live in a scroll. We have, a lot of us have a very short attention span. So a lot of the information that we get, sometimes we don't necessarily read all the way through it because we're so used to getting information so quick and so fast. So talking about that and a physical, what physical archiving is, and also talking about digital archiving and what that's going to look like in our futures as well. And I just want to say, I guess, to kind of wrap this up, is just like, use the tools that you have. You know, sometimes we will look for other people to give us the things that we need. And I would like to say, as myself as an archivist and starting this project, I didn't have any tools, you know, like I wasn't waiting for somebody to give me something. I created it for myself, and I created it for the community that I serve. So I just want y'all to think about that. You know, when you are developing systems, I think we're in a time of great healing, internal healing as a collective. And I think when we come out of this, you know, transformational process of like the phoenix rising out the ashes, I feel like we'll be able to come together and build beautiful systems, of not systems of like this capitalist, you know, bullshit, but like we'll be able to understand what our needs are as a community and move forward as a collective in order to build a world, like Imani was saying earlier, that we can see for ourselves, that we can live in our, you know, in our own shit. So I just definitely keep that in mind. And once again, thank y'all for, I'm learning so much just listening to y'all speak. So thank y'all. Definitely. I can't hear you if you're talking.
Sorry, y'all. I apologize. But you know, crew, you've said this, and a lot of other folks have said this. We've talked about the power of like collective action, the power of collective groups, and just the power of supporting one another, and how healing and how beautiful that is. And I feel like we've also really talked a lot tonight about, you know, creating our own spaces, because these spaces aren't made for us. And like you said, crew, creating your own resources, right? And I know I really want to like kind of think about like some action steps that folks can take right now to support the queer community. And I know something that we've been talking about internally as a group is just like art and healing. And we talked about it at the beginning of the panel too, with some of our heroes, thinking about Baldwin, thinking about the artists of the Renaissance movement, the Harlem Renaissance movement, and just how much art has really influenced our work. But I also really believe in the power of art as healing, and how great of a tool that can be. And I know, Crystal, you do a ton of that work, and that's really your focus. And I just want to like really, as we start to close out our conversation and we start to think about action steps, I would love to hear from you in terms of how you really think, Crystal, people can be using art and other creative tools to really start that process of healing and justice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I want to say first and foremost, one of the main things that Queer Rebel does, and from the beginning when it was started by KB Boyce, a Black trans man, and their partner Celeste Chan, was that to pay our artists. So we also feel like that healing art making begins with us. And that means paying people so they have time to like create their work, and so that they also know that their work is valuable. And I don't mean that in that capitalist sort of way, but I mean that your time is valuable, your thought is valuable, your dreams and hopes are valuable. So that's one of the reasons why we make sure we pay all of our artists. And also to understand that we're not just telling our stories, but we're also giving space for QTPOCC people to tell the story of what we could be, of what we were. And I feel like that's important in this moment, because I feel like, you know, we have to be able to imagine a moment beyond this, a moment where we actually can get over our transphobia, where we can actually root out the oppressor in all of us, which sometimes keeps us from being able to continue to do this work. How many organizations do we all know that have fallen apart because we simply can't communicate with each other, because we can't imagine a world beyond white supremacy and capitalism? So art is also about that. And also I just want to say, like, wrap it up about the healing part, is that I would say again, this work is like has been going on for a long time, and will need to continue going on for a long time. So again, we have to realize that we live in a world and in systems that hurt all of us. And we carry that hurt with us. And we carry that hurt into the streets when we demonstrate, into the rooms where we talk about it, to the people who are sitting beside us. So art is important, but the healing parts of the art is what's important, because we also have to heal while we're fighting, right? we have to continue to connect with our tender hearts so that we can continue moving. Like I said, I'm going to wrap it up and just go back to this thing, is that we all are going to have to bring all of ourselves if we're going to move this mountain.
Yeah, and I love...
I feel like this is a thing we have to remember. And so we have to look askance at people who keep asking us to leave little parts of us behind, because they're not for us. And I don't care what color they are or what gender they are or whatever. Anybody who asks you to leave something behind, they're not for you. And we have to remember that.
Thank you, Crystal. That's like a really beautiful and just like powerful sentiment. That's why I apologize. I was like jumping in to say something because I was so excited about what you were saying. It just really resonated with me. And I really think it's a beautiful place to kind of start wrapping up the conversation too, because really what you're talking about and what we've all been talking about tonight is this idea of envisioning Black queer futures and envisioning Black queer free futures. So that means defunding the police. That means centering Black trans women. That means creating inclusive reproductive justice policies. That means ensuring that Black queer trans folks can get jobs that pay well, that respect them and their dignity. That means, you know, like Crew was saying, really sharing the resources equitably and creating these new systems to share information. Like everything we're talking about tonight and everything that Crystal, you just like wrapped up so beautifully is just thinking about envisioning free Black queer futures. And I really want to like challenge everyone who's joining us tonight in the conversation in the audience to think about that and think about, as Tony was talking about earlier, how you can be an accomplice to the Black queer trans folks in your life, to the Black LGBT folks in your life, how you can show up for them. And I want to just like take a moment before we wrap up to uplift some incredible organizations that are doing that work. Our panelists have already done some of that. Tony mentioned Transgender Law Center. Preston, of course, works at URGE. Amani, of course, with NCLR. Crystal with Queer Rebels, like Crew with Black Lesbian Archives. Y'all are repping so many great organizations already. And there are some others I want to uplift. The Ochre Project is really great. If y'all haven't heard about them, they feed Black queer trans folks. We also have the Marsha P. Johnson Institute. Also, obviously want to uplift Marsha and the historical legacy she left behind. And they're just doing great policy work and research work and service work supporting Black trans folks in particular. The TGI Justice Project. Here in the Bay Area, we have, of course, I mentioned Bay Area Lesbian Archives that Crew's doing. So there are just so many organizations out there, y'all. And, you know, we could spend a whole hour and a half just talking about all the work that all the great organizations doing the work, but unfortunately we don't have that much time. But I do just want to end by kind of giving folks space if they want to share one last tidbit of information or something that's like really on their heart, or if there's another organization they want to uplift. I just want to make space for our panelists to close this out tonight.
I just want to give a quick shout out to my girl Imani on the other end. If it wasn't for her, Black Lesbian Archives wouldn't be what it is now. So much love to you, Imani.
Right back to you. You did such a great job with it, Crew. I'm so proud to know you.
Thank you. Me too.
And I really just want to take that moment to thank all of y'all, all our panelists tonight for joining us, especially people on the East Coast. Just like shout out to our East Coast panelists. It is very late on the East Coast. So thank you for bearing with us and thank you for being a part of this conversation. This was honestly the biggest honor of my career so far as in moderating this conversation. And I'm not kidding when I say that. Just so many brilliant Black, queer, trans, out and proud voices in one space. Quite frankly, I can't remember another event or panel that's been this like Black and queer and just out there and trans and in your face. So I think, you know, speaking of history, and I want to end with this, I want to say, like, I really believe this conversation was historic tonight, and really believe all the work that y'all are doing is historic. And hopefully through all of our work, you know, one day, 40, 50 years from now, or even later in the future, people will be having a similar panel talking about Black queer futures and Black queer visions under much better circumstances. And maybe some of us will be part of that conversation as ancestors. So thank you everyone who joined us tonight, audience members. Thank you to all of our panelists. And that's it, we're gonna sign off. So I hope everyone has a good night, stay safe from COVID, wear masks, social distance, and support your Black queer trans friends. Bye, y'all.
Thanks, everybody. It was a great
Thank you.
Bye, thank y'all. And great job moderating, Bryce.
Oh, thank you. Wait, are we still live, Lee?
Yes.
We are, I see it.
Oh, okay, my bad. I didn't realize that.